What's good, y'all? Thank you so much for joining us for our Wellington Heights Community Church podcast. I'm Pastor Keeyon, and I have a special guest today. Eric Gutschmidt is joining us. Say hi, Eric.
How's it going? How's everybody doing today?
So, Eric, I'm going to give him a little time to kind of introduce himself, but I did want to kind of run through how we met and who Eric is. So, Eric is an investor and developer in the Wellington Heights neighborhood, and I think, again, we met through sharing space at the Wellington Heights Association board, and I think I stepped down in 2022, just because of the church and all of the things that it takes to run a church. So, and then we began to start meeting just about the association, but also we found out that we have a lot of interest in the flourishing of the Wellington Heights neighborhood, and then most recently. Eric, he actually took me on a tour of the Wellington Heights neighborhood, kind of talking about the history of the Wellington Heights neighborhood. He also took the Atlanta team from Focus Community Strategies. They came and kind of wanted to know more about Wellington Heights, and so Eric was one of those people that got to give them a tour and kind of tell them about the making, at least in the last 100 years, of Wellington Heights. So the purpose of the podcast and the purpose of kind of having Eric here is to really give a historical account of the Wellington Heights neighborhood. Because I think a lot of times when people think about distressed neighborhoods or hoods, they look at it and they say, that's a hood because people are lazy, or there's maybe a derogatory or racist kind of narrative that they have in their mind. And I think that going through the history of lots of spaces, I think it's so important to know the truth about spaces and places. And so I wanted to give you kind of time to kind of introduce yourself, tell us something interesting about you, and then we'll start with those questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pastor Keeyon. My name is Eric Gutschmidt. 15 years ago, I bought and rehabbed a small apartment building. My goal at the time was to use the proceeds to be able to travel. That's my great passion. My bucket list goal is to visit every country in the world before I pass on.
How many have you visited?
Yeah, so I think I'm up to 52. Ooh. So 52 out of 196.
What's your favorite?
Colombia,
okay.
By far. Colombia is amazing. The coffee, just the people, the culture, the landscape, just everything about Colombia is really awesome.
What's something that you have to do when you go to these countries? What are some of the things you're looking for?
Yeah, so honestly, one of the big things that I look for, although I'm only more recently understanding what this is, but one of the big things that I look for is not just culture, but third spaces. If you go to any country in the world, if I go to any country in the world, I want to meet people, I want to talk to people. Maybe this is a touristy thing, maybe it's not, but I want to be in a place where I can start to understand culture in a more intimate way, just by observation, not necessarily by having a tour guide. And a third space is awesome because that is a space similar to where the church would be considered a third space, right? This is not your work, this is not your home, and this is also not some place where you have to spend money to exist at. Someone can exist in this church for free, and that then encourages social behavior, right? Social bonds to be built, and in spaces where social bonds are being built and strengthened and existing, you then can start to understand how people interact with each other in space. In comparison, if you go to a restaurant or a coffee shop, you're working with someone who's making money to be there. This then puts on a little bit of a facade, which is good. I appreciate good service, even if it's a facade. And at the same time, if you are going to a place where you're working, then you're in a professional capacity. There's rules to this. But in a third space, you're more free to express yourself as you please, express political opinions, ideological opinions, bounce ideas off of other people, and this is really, I think, what shapes culture.
You're able to kind of be yourself. That's really cool. And I'm sure Cedar Rapids has many third places.
Kind of, but so historically, and this is I'm sure not to jump ahead,
Oh
but
yeah.
historically, before the advent of the internet and social media, and before life got so fast, there was a lot of third spaces, and actually like our national politics are based off of it. That's why we have things like the Electoral College. That's why our politics like breaks down so granularly, as opposed to being so like centrally loaded. But it does that because hundreds of years ago, there was a bunch of tiny third spaces dotted all across the country, and that's places of worship. That's like Masonic lodges, the Elks lodges, libraries, parks. You know what I mean? Any sort of like coffee shop or cafe where it's like not like Starbucks, where like, you know what I mean, they're not like shushing you out after your cup's empty. So places like that used to be everywhere, and that's how social bonds were created. That's how people came up with new ideas. That's like where those happened.
Yeah.
But then as like life got faster, and as like social media took hold and people kind of recoiled into themselves and into their phones, then you had the third spaces break down, because third spaces often like aren't profitable. How do you like have a profitable roof where people can congregate and not spend money? Like that's against capitalism, right? So as the third spaces were breaking down and then social media was rising up, people have pulled back, and it's no wonder that we're more polarized now than ever. And I do believe that is the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think as a church, we always we press up against kind of that fast pace in order to create like this idea of like slowing down so that we can see each other. Jumping into the first question, and as a preface, at Wellington Heights Church, we're deeply rooted in the Wellington Heights neighborhood, and we care about the well-being of this neighborhood. One of the things that we often say on a Sunday is, if we flourish on a Sunday like butts and seats, but the neighborhood isn't flourishing, then we call that a failure. And while you're not a member of the church, I do consider you a friend, not only of me and my family, but a friend of the church and a supporter of the church. So could you share about your connection and support for the Wellington Heights mission? Yeah,
there's a bunch of churches in Wellington Heights. I'm not personally very religious, but I recognize some of the challenges of the neighborhood, and I recognize the church as being an amazing catalytic organization that has the potential to take the lead in really turning the neighborhood around. What I deal with mostly is the built environment, and so I deal with, you know what I mean, put this wall here, make a doorway there, paint this color. I deal with the built environment. But the church deals with like people's lives in a more intimate way, and the neighborhood is the combination then between the built environment and people's lives. In the neighborhood, this neighborhood's been around for 150 years almost. Sometimes the structures change, right? The neighborhood is not made up of the structures, because sometimes a house gets bulldozed to make a parking lot, to make a clinic, maybe catches fire, it gets bulldozed and a new house is built. So the neighborhood is not necessarily the built structures, and the neighborhood is also not necessarily the individual people, because the people move into the neighborhood, move out of the neighborhood, people are born, people pass on. The neighborhood is that social bond that like brings it all together, and that social bond evolves over time as the buildings change and as the people change.
I've heard it said before, like the church is unique in that it can see people from womb to tomb, like and churches know generation after generation. And I think if a church is like committed to the neighborhood, it's going to know kind of some history. And we're only 4 years old, but I think that's kind of one of our goals too, is just to be the community church that's always here in a place where everybody can kind of. And I think just our relationship, it's been cool to see you kind of, like you say, you're not a member, you're not religious, but you actually partner and you actually cheer on the things that we care about, that may be empowered by our faith, but also empowered just by like wanting to see people flourish in general. So, in a past podcast, I did episode called "If You Want to Love Your City, You Have to Learn Your City," and I really stress the significance of understanding your neighborhood, and like, because a lot of times, again, I said at the intro, if you look at a neighborhood, you just assume it is what it is because of the last maybe year or behavior. So how crucial is it to have historical knowledge of a city or neighborhood for the flourishing of that city or neighborhood? How crucial is it for us to know how it became the way it is?
Yeah, I would say that it's paramount, because if you don't understand what got you here, how are you going to try to get out of it? So often the remedy is only derived from understanding the causation, right? And so, and those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. Even now today, we have conversations, I'm hearing conversations in the neighborhood that are reminiscent of ones that were had in the 50s and 60s that were unhelpful in the 50s and 60s and would be just as easily unhelpful now. But yet, folks that don't understand what got us there into the 50s and 60s and what got us there today are still proposing the same solutions.
Yeah.
And I wish that we lived in a world where the solutions were simple. That would be awesome. Sometimes I see in books and movies where the plot is that, like, oh, the solution was so simple all along. Unfortunately, I don't find the world to be so simple.
Yeah.
And I think that it's then our obligation to, as we try to make the world a better place, I think that it's our obligation then to actually do some of the hard work, because this is what's called for.
Yeah.
It's not just easy all the time.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, people can have nostalgia about something, or like remember the good old days, but sometimes the good old days was good for certain people.
Exactly.
And a certain person, and people experience situations differently. So even a good situation can be different to everyone. So not only hearing like this historical account from you that you got from other people, because we'll go into like Wellington Heights historical account in the next question, but like you did a good job of like hearing from many stories. And so I think it's so important for us to continue asking questions. One of the things about this building is when we got this building, we asked people who lived in this neighborhood, how important is this building to the neighborhood? What it mean? This building was a grocery store. It was a community center for people. It was an art center. And just hearing, sometimes we get people who just knock on the door and say, I just want to see the building. Like, you know what I mean? And I'm passing through. I don't live in Cedar Rapids, but I wanted to see the building again. So even that as an example of like history, it all means something different to people. And so getting those perspectives is important to knowing the flourishing. You recently gave a tour to me, I think last year, and then this April, our Atlanta team for the Flourishing Neighborhood Index, you were recovering, so we thank you for that. But you recovering from a hip injury, something like that? Yeah. So you graciously gave us a tour, and they loved it, just by the way. I mean, they were like, that was like the highlight, and just being able, I think they're gonna now make that a precedent for other cities to get like a historical account of the neighborhood that they're working on. And so I would love to hear and elaborate kind of on that. I mean, obviously within 5 to 10 minutes, but like housing significance, what was the original vision of Wellington Heights, the demographic makeup, kind of what led to how Wellington Heights is today from what you've gathered from people.
Yeah, and
here we go.
Preface it by saying I'm not a professional historian,
yeah.
But I do think that it's important to always remain curious, and so I don't necessarily have the academic background in real estate development or neighborhood building, but I'm curious and I've seen a number of things along the way. So with Wellington Heights, this was actually a very unique thing for Cedar Rapids. Wellington Heights was built out at a time when the city was small. In the late 1800s, Cedar Rapids had a population of maybe 10,000. And similarly, the city of Miami at that time also had a population of around 10,000. Turns out the pretty waters and the beach won out in the end, and Miami took its course and Cedar Rapids took its course. But I say that to say that at the time that Wellington was platted out, Cedar Rapids was not a large city. It was an industrial city, whereas Marion was a railroad town. Cedar Rapids in Wellington Heights was meant to be almost like a streetcar suburb. At the time that Wellington was platted, it was largely before the automobile, and Cedar Rapids did have a series of streetcar lines that went through the neighborhood. Wellington Heights was platted out before single-family zoning existed, and Wellington Heights was platted out as a mixed income neighborhood distinctly. And what I mean by that is there was mansions. A mansion is a mansion is a mansion. It is meant for affluence, as it has always been. But then there was also more humble houses that a doctor or a lawyer back then likely would not have chosen. And then there was apartment buildings and multifamily buildings that were baked into the neighborhood from the beginning. In this way, Wellington Heights then had schools. McKinley was built shortly after the neighborhood was platted out. And then the lawyer and the doctor and the pastor's children went to that school, as did the janitor's children, because they all lived in the neighborhood and they all played together. And I think that there's an overwhelming body of evidence, academic evidence, that indicates that the world is made a better place if rich kids and poor kids play together. It has the best outcomes for both. In comparison, when you get, you know what I mean, little pockets or little enclaves of affluence, the children that come from that are usually a little bit less cultured, and there's blind spots that then are baked into their upbringing. So Wellington Heights was built before central air conditioning. All the houses have big front porches, and there's great sidewalks. And what would happen in Iowa is it would be too hot in the summer to be inside before dark. So folks would hang out on their front porch, rain or shine. They would hang out on their front porch and they would socialize. And if they weren't hanging out on their front porch in the evenings, then they would go for a walk and they would talk to other people hanging out on their front porch. So Wellington Heights was built so that it would encourage people to walk and to socialize. In comparison, after the Spanish flu of 1918, in our architecture, the front porches went away. The large backyards started to proliferate with the tall fences, and that was kind of the beginning of a more isolating trend in architecture. So Great Depression hits, and the property values in places like Wellington Heights just absolutely bottom out, right? So houses in Wellington Heights may have lost 50% or 75% of their value during the Great Depression. The country then went through the Second World War, and the city evolved and changed. And then coming out of the Second World War, we had the advent of federally subsidized housing through the VA and then the FHA, where the federal government said that they would guarantee house loans. At that time, they created a criteria for what would count as a house that the government would insure, and they looked at neighborhood demographics, and famously or infamously, that's where the redlining maps came from. And I think with redlining, which I'm not an academic expert in, but I think I have a fairly good understanding. To understand redlining, you have to understand what happens when a half dozen or a dozen different industry groups all puts their thumb on the scale lightly. None of them did anything that was that crazy. They just lightly put their thumb on the scale, but in doing so, in concert, this half dozen or dozen different industry groups, they then created an incredibly disparate outcome. So for Wellington Heights, you had the insurance industry decided that Wellington Heights was higher risk because people of color lived there or lived here. You then had the banks that said, oh, well, the insurance industry says that this is higher risk, so we're not going to loan there. You then had realtors who said, oh, you know what I mean, white client of mine, don't buy in Wellington Heights because you won't have the same like property value returns. You then had narratives that, you know what I mean, this was a troubled neighborhood, so then we sent in more police, and police, by the nature of their job, find crime. If you send police into an affluent neighborhood, they will find crime in the affluent neighborhood. If you send police into a poor neighborhood, they'll find crime in the poor neighborhood. So then the neighborhood was over-policed. The small amount of lending that you could get, or the industry that you could get, was one where landlords came in, or real estate investors or developers came in, and they took the old mansions and they cut them into small pieces, and they let out or they rented out small apartments or small rooms for rent. They weren't incentivized, these property owners, these slumlords, they weren't incentivized to care for their properties. They were just trying to extract out as much profit as possible. Why would you spend thousands of dollars to replace a roof if you could instead just band-aid it for a couple hundred, right? This directly correlates with the profit. And in Cedar Rapids, you can genuinely see the houses right outside of the red line neighborhood, right? 19th Street was the red line. And you can see that the houses right outside of it hold their value much better. But even so far as like the houses sag in Wellington. And the reason why they sag is because of those little things like band-aiding the roof instead of fixing the roof. If you have old wood and if it gets wet and if it gets termites and it starts to sag, the porches in Wellington sag more often than the porches in Beaver Park right across 19th Street. And now we find ourselves in this mess where Wellington Heights, people know that there's a stigma. They don't necessarily know why there's a stigma. They associate it obviously with people of color and rentership and crime and all of these other things. They can't necessarily define it, but they know the stigma is there. And so what I can say professionally, from having torn apart houses all over this town that have all manner of vintages, right? So I think the oldest house that we have was one that was built in the 1880s. And then we build houses. So we have houses that were built in 2023, 2024, right? And what I can say is that the houses in Wellington Heights are the best built houses of any before or since in Cedar Rapids. Yet this negative stigma and all of this like negativity has caused them to be worth less money. By all rights, like the best built car should be the car that holds its value the best, right? But what would happen if you took, and I'm not trying to pick on Toyota, but Toyota builds good cars, right? They have a reputation for building good cars. What would happen if you took Toyota and you gave them this negative stigma and you said Toyota is associated with higher crime, it's associated with poor people, it's associated with undesirable people, it's associated with people of color who are also stigmatized and marginalized? The public then would say, oh, Toyotas have all of these negative stigmas. The public then would change if a person in the public owned a Toyota, they would change the oil less frequently. They would change the tires less frequently. They would change the wipers less frequently. They would get fewer car washes. And then those Toyotas would become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And I feel like that's totally not only like just the view of outside of a neighborhood that has negative, but the inside. Like if you live in the neighborhood, and you've lived in the neighborhood for all your life and your generations, and you have those negative, perspectives coming, there's no wonder why someone would litter, right? Because that's created this culture of like, this is not the place I want to be, this is just where I am. Where I want to be is outside this neighborhood. And so in some of our sermon series, over the summer, we talked about relocations. Like we want people to come here, and we want this place to be a place you want to go to, right? And for those who are, in poverty or in the working class, we want to come alongside them so that they can be leaders in their ideas and their dreams can happen right here. You don't have to leave Wellington Heights. You don't have to leave the so-called hood in order to get your dreams. You can leave, get education, and then come back and invest.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we really agree. It's like, what if this was a place where people wanted to be?
Right.
You know, what do you think some of the issues are that we face in 2024? You know, I know that like, you know, white flight brought about a lot of the negativity. I know that, you know, once the law changed and black people could legally live wherever we wanted, that brought about white flight. And then I think even before we recorded this podcast, we talked about how like drug cartel kind of came into a lot of neighborhoods, right, all over the nation, and targeted black bodies to sell or to use, right? And as a black person, like in the 60s and 70s, you know, if the factory is not hiring you because you're black, and you know you can't really get a job that's going to support your mouths, you got to choose between moving, which people don't just move, right? You got to choose between moving to a place that maybe will accept you, or this guy saying if you sell this drug for $1,000, you're like, hey, as a man, as a woman, you want to take care of your family, so you do that, and then drugs kind of become built into the neighborhood. And so a lot of times people will just assume that this people group is this way, or this people group is that way. It's like, actually, there's a historical account of how a neighborhood got the way it is. And so what are some of the things that you think are like our challenges that we maybe really need to address? You can talk about, you know, slumlords, things like that.
Yeah, so I think the slumlords exist in the neighborhood because the city, the powers that be before our time, knew that Cedar Rapids needed to have affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
Cedar Rapids was not a city that did any sort of government funded housing, really, not in earnest, whereas larger metropolitan areas did. And so what Cedar Rapids did, and again, I'm not trying to put fault with anyone who's currently in power, but they allowed then for neighborhoods like Wellington to be the affordable housing of the city. And the trade-off, though, was that then they let the landlords, the slumlords, do whatever they wanted. So there was little to no oversight of the conditions that people were living in. And that was the trade-off of trying to then have the free market produce affordable housing, which I personally think is unwise, to say the least. What's happening now, though, is a predictable thing. There's a process that they talk about in academic circles called filtration, whereby a neighborhood predictably runs itself down, bottoms out, and then comes back. Because this neighborhood, Wellington, is close to downtown, it's close to amenities, it has the sewer, the water, the street infrastructure in place, so it has a lot going for it. And predictably, after it bottoms out, it will predictably, as hundreds of neighborhoods across the country have, it will predictably come back. I believe that has already happened, that the corner has already been turned. So I see the greatest challenge now of our lifetimes, as it relates to the neighborhood, is how can we steward this rebirth of the neighborhood in a way that is equitable, that still cares for the most vulnerable, that does not large scale push people out. How do we get Wellington back to a place where it is a healthy mixed income neighborhood instead of a toxic mixed income neighborhood?
Yes, and I think that's a desire for a lot of people in neighborhoods like Wellington Heights all over the nation. Like, how do we balance, like, how do we not gentrify this neighborhood, right? But how do we make it flourish, like, and expect excellence? Because we don't want just the people to be happy with crappy houses, you know.
Right.
No, like we actually as a faith community, we see that as a good news or gospel calling to, if we often say, like, you, wherever your church is at, you should reflect it and affect it. So like reflect the people that, like, on a Sunday it should reflect, or at least on the groups that make up your neighborhood, or at least your city, and then it should affect it in some way, right? And within church history, you know, at least the last 50 years, that feeling of affecting your neighborhood is kind of daunting, because it's kind of daunting. And so a lot of, I would say, predominantly white churches, they planted out in the field so that they didn't have to focus on the neighborhood anymore. We just focus on the individuals that come here. And so before the 1950s, 60s and 50s, churches were based in neighborhoods, right? And so we're trying to get back to that community church where we do have a burden of affecting our neighborhood in a positive way, because that's what our faith tells us. Jesus says, my kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That means like it should be, you know what I mean, that heaven should be right here, right? Like, and so don't just wait to heaven for heaven. I've called you to make heaven amongst you, right? Basically in the idea of loving all. If I love you, you love me, you should care about my well-being, like at the end of the day. And so, so I kind of want to end it with, what is thriving? What is flourishing to you? You kind of touched on that at the end, but like, what is a thriving Wellington Heights community look like to you, and how do we continue to promote neighborhood flourishing?
I think that's a great question. I think that really strikes it on the head, because I think flourishing is a goal that is measured by the social bonds. It's measured by the social bonds of the neighborhood. Again, it's not measured by the individual humans that make up the neighborhood who may move in and out. It's not measured by the colors of the buildings or what style of roof they have. It's defined by the social bonds. And I would say that Wellington is a good neighborhood, or a positive neighborhood, or a flourishing neighborhood, if the social bonds are set up in a way that makes people's lives better. I want people's lives to be better because they live in Wellington, not worse because they live in Wellington. Good. And places like the church, and I don't just mean like the building as a third space, but places like the church, the body of the church and the philosophy of the church that encourages these positive social bonds. And you, Pastor Keeyon, I've seen you just talk to people in the neighborhood who are not members of the congregation, but they're your neighbors. And you care about their well-being, and you try to interact with them in a way that leaves you both better off for having interacted. And I think that is a thing that can spread, but I think that that's also a thing that can be engineered. I think that we can make a world that encourages more of that. Just like putting a front porch close to a sidewalk encourages people to talk to each other. The way that we build it can encourage the outcome. And I think that not just the way that we build the buildings, but also the way that we structure the institutions, right? The church is an institution, also can encourage the outcome. And I think that is the critical thing for the neighborhood right now.
I was gonna give you a follow-up question, but you answered it, like, what is the charge for the church? And I think our systems within the church need some reshaping of how can we be more inclusive to the people outside the church that may not want to join on a Sunday, but the reality of, like, the church is made up of people, right? And so how can we go to them and them come to us in a mutual way, and not some kind of like insular thing. And so I think within that, when you create those communities, or you said social something, but those communities where people can, of all walks of life, can like sit at the table, right? That's when we actually learn. And I feel like there's a reality that we are all made in the image of God, right? Like no matter what your social location is and how we can respect each other, know that I can learn from this person, even though I disagree with this person, I can learn from this person. This person is not a project. This person is a person just like me, and we can mutually grow together.
Mm-hmm.
So, any last words, man?
No, I think that, I would just say to folks, don't sleep on Wellington Heights.
Mm-hmm.
If there's events going on down here, if
Yes.
the church has events down here, if you have friends down here, you will be sad if you miss this, because like Wellington Heights is going through a moment, and maybe that moment is a year, maybe that moment is a decade, maybe it's 2 decades, maybe it's 5 decades, but it's going through a moment of rebirth.
Yes.
That you'll want to be a part of. Don't miss out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time, Eric.
Yes.
Thank you. You guys have a great rest of your day. Be blessed.